In the grand theatre of galactic civilization, where species are catalogued with the same clinical precision that one might use to organise a spice rack, humanity had earned itself a rather unflattering designation. Not apex predator, like the towering Krillian war beasts, not intellectual superior, like the crystalline ethereals, and certainly not economically dominant, like the merchant guilds of Proxima. No, humans had been filed neatly under prey species subcategory, surprisingly resilient for their size. The Galactic Species Classification Board, a bureaucratic nightmare that made tax season look like a delightful picnic, had spent roughly 3 standard cycles debating humanity's placement. The debate wasn't whether humans were dangerous. That much was laughably obvious to anyone who'd witnessed their tendency to punch things significantly larger than themselves. The debate was whether they qualified as semi-capable prey, or just prey with delusions of grandeur. They'd settled on the latter naturally. The board had a reputation to maintain after all, and admitting that a species barely 2 meters tall and lacking natural weapons might pose any real threat would have been career suicide. Far better to acknowledge their scrappy nature while keeping them firmly in the might make decent pets, if properly domesticated category. This classification system worked wonderfully for everyone involved, particularly the Vex 3. The Vex 3 were what happened when evolution decided to take the concept of apex predator and run with it until it reached its logical, terrifying conclusion. Standing nearly 4 meters at their lowest point because they were quadrupedal in the way that nightmares are quadrupedal. They possessed all the charm of a particularly irritable mountain crossed with a meat grinder. Their hide was chitinous black. Their eyes glowed with the sort of inner fire that suggested they found violence personally fulfilling, and their claws could carve through starship hulls with the casual ease of opening a particularly stubborn jar of pickles. More importantly, they had culture. Not the refined philosophical sort of culture that led to poetry and artistic expression, but the kind of culture that revolved entirely around the fine art of hunting. They had rituals for tracking, ceremonies for the kill, and an entire social hierarchy based on who could bring down the most interesting prey. It was, by their standards, a perfectly reasonable way to organise a society. The Vex 3 had heard about humans naturally. Word travelled fast in galactic circles, especially when it concerned new additions to the things we can hunt without causing diplomatic incidents list. The reports were encouraging. Bipedal, soft-skinned, no natural weapons to speak of, and with a curious tendency to establish colonies on remote worlds where help was inconveniently far away. In Vex 3 terms, this translated roughly to gift-wrapped entertainment, which brought them to Kepler 442c, a thoroughly unremarkable rock orbiting a thoroughly unremarkable star, where a thoroughly unremarkable human settlement had decided to set up shop. The world itself was pleasant enough. Breathable atmosphere, reasonable gravity, and the sort of pastoral scenery that made colonists nostalgic for Earth, right up until the local fauna tried to eat them. The human settlement numbered perhaps 2,000 souls, all engaged in the noble pursuit of turning an alien wilderness into something resembling civilization. The Vex 3 hunting party that had recently arrived in system found this arrangement perfectly acceptable. Remote location, minimal defences, and prey that was reportedly both clever enough to provide sport and soft enough to make the eventual kill satisfying. It was, by their standards, an ideal hunting ground. The woman who would shortly complicate their entire worldview was, at that precise moment, engaged in the most human of activities, feeding something that didn't need feeding simply because she found it pleasant. Every morning, without fail, she would emerge from her modest dwelling on the colony's outskirts, carrying a small cloth bag filled with seeds. The local avians, colourful creatures roughly analogous to earthbirds, if earthbirds had been designed by someone with a particularly whimsical sense of aesthetics, had learned to expect her. They would gather in chattering clouds, perching on fence posts and power lines with a sort of eager anticipation typically reserved for payday. She would scatter the seeds with practiced efficiency, speaking to the birds in the conversational tone that humans inexplicably used when addressing creatures that clearly couldn't understand them. The birds, for their part, seemed to appreciate both the food and the commentary, though whether this was genuine appreciation or simply learned behaviour was a question for evolutionary biologists with too much time on their hands. The Vex 3 scouts, observing from the tree line with the patience of professional predators, found this behaviour both baffling and encouraging. Baffling because it served no apparent survival purpose. The birds were perfectly capable of finding their own food, and feeding them provided no obvious benefit to the human. Encouraging because it suggested a level of naive trust in her environment that would make their eventual approach significantly easier. The lead scout, a particularly scarred veteran of numerous hunts, made careful notes in the sophisticated recording device strapped to his forearm. Prey species demonstrates consistent routine. Limited awareness of surroundings during feeding activity. Appears to prioritize care of non-essential local fauna over personal security. Classification. Optimal target for demonstration hunt. The demonstration hunt was something of a Vex 3 tradition. When establishing dominance over a new world, it was considered proper form to select the most isolated, most vulnerable member of the prey population and make an example of them. Not out of cruelty, mind you. The Vex 3 were many things, but needlessly cruel wasn't among them. It was simply good practice, a clear statement of intent that would make subsequent hunts more sporting, as the remaining prey would be appropriately wary. The woman, blissfully unaware that she'd been selected for this honour, continued her morning routine with the sort of peaceful contentment that comes from believing the universe is, generally speaking, a benevolent place. She scattered seeds, spoke softly to birds, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of watching small creatures go about their business without the weight of galactic politics pressing down on their tiny shoulders. The irony, though she couldn't know it yet, was that her very ordinariness made her extraordinary. In a galaxy where every species had been neatly categorized, where behavior patterns had been studied and documented and filed away in databases, she represented something the classification system hadn't accounted for. She was about to become the first human to break the food chain simply by refusing to acknowledge its existence. The Vex 3 scouts settled in to wait, confident in their assessment and comfortable with their choice of target. After all, what could possibly go wrong when hunting a creature whose greatest daily challenge was remembering to bring enough birdseed? Behind them, deeper in the forest, something small and injured was crying for its mother. The universe, as it turns out, has a rather twisted sense of timing. Just as the Vex 3 scouts were congratulating themselves on selecting the perfect target for their demonstration hunt, their carefully laid plans encountered what military strategists politely call an unforeseen variable, and what everyone else calls life deciding to be complicated. The woman had finished her morning bird feeding ritual and was walking back toward the colony along her usual path, a well-worn trail that meandered through the local forest with the sort of casual indifference to efficiency that characterized most human path-making. She was humming something tuneless and pleasant, the kind of absent-minded melody that humans produced when they were content and unaware that apex predators were currently debating the best angle of approach for her eventual demise. The sound that stopped her mid-hum was not the sort of sound one expected to hear in a peaceful alien forest. It was high-pitched, distressed, and carried the unmistakable quality of something young and in considerable pain. More importantly, it was coming from just off the main path, where the undergrowth grew thick enough to hide all manner of potentially dangerous local wildlife. Any reasonable person, particularly one living on a frontier world where potentially dangerous local wildlife was less of a theoretical concern and more of a daily reality, would have noted the sound, perhaps felt a moment of sympathy, and continued walking. After all, nature was full of unpleasant realities, and getting involved in the local ecosystem's drama was typically a fast track to becoming part of that drama in ways that didn't end well for soft-skinned bipeds. The woman, however, possessed that particularly human trait that had caused her species so much trouble throughout their brief but eventful history: an inability to ignore suffering when she encountered it, regardless of the potential consequences to her own well-being. She pushed through the undergrowth with the determined clumsiness of someone who had never quite mastered the art of moving quietly through dense vegetation. Branches caught at her clothing, leaves tangled in her hair, and she made enough noise to alert every predator within a 3-kilometre radius to her exact location. The VEX-3 scouts, monitoring her progress with growing confusion, updated their tactical assessments from optimal target to either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. What she found in the small clearing beyond the undergrowth was enough to make any sensible person reconsider their life choices. 2 young VEX-3 cubs, though calling them cubs was rather like calling a juvenile dragon a particularly large lizard, lay tangled in what appeared to be the remnants of a primitive snare trap. The trap itself was clearly not of human design. The colonists were many things, but they weren't stupid enough to set snares that could catch apex predators. This looked like the work of some other local species, something with a very poor understanding of local food chain dynamics. The cubs were perhaps 1.5 meters long, which made them roughly the size of Earth ponies, if Earth ponies had been designed by someone with a particularly dark imagination. Their chitinous hide was already developing the characteristic black coloration of adult VEX-3, though it still retained patches of the mottled grey that marked them as juveniles. One had a gash along its flank where the snare had cut deep, while the other appeared to have injured a leg in its struggle to escape. They were, by any objective measure, absolutely terrifying. Even as juveniles, they possessed claws that could easily disembowel an adult human, teeth designed for tearing through significantly tougher prey than anything the local ecosystem had to offer, and the sort of natural predatory instincts that made them dangerous even when injured and distressed. The woman took one look at them and immediately began searching through her small day pack for her emergency medical kit. This reaction was so fundamentally contrary to every known principle of predator-prey dynamics that the VEX-3 scouts observing from concealment actually stopped breathing for several seconds. According to every study ever conducted on interspecies interactions, a prey species encountering injured predators should either flee immediately, if flight wasn't possible, attempt to ensure the predators couldn't recover enough to pose a future threat. What they absolutely should not do was approach the injured predators with obvious intent to provide medical assistance. The woman, blissfully unaware that she was rewriting several volumes of xenobiological research, knelt beside the first cub and began examining the snare with the focused attention of someone solving a particularly interesting puzzle. The cub, understandably confused by this turn of events, attempted to snap at her with enough force to remove her arm at the shoulder. She dodged the attack with the sort of casual competence that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with injured animals, and continued working on the trap mechanism. "Easy there," she murmured in the soothing tone that humans inexplicably used when attempting to calm creatures that were actively trying to kill them. "I know you're scared, but I'm trying to help." The cub, of course, understood none of this. What it did understand was that a prey creature was voluntarily placing itself within striking distance, and its every instinct screamed that this was either a trap or evidence that the universe had fundamentally broken down. Cubs might be young, but they weren't stupid. Prey didn't help predators. Prey ran, or hid, or died. They did not kneel beside injured hunters and speak in gentle voices while working to free them from constraints. The woman succeeded in loosening the first snare, carefully lifting the wire away from the cub's injured flank. The relief was immediate and obvious. The cub's pained whimpering quieted, and some of the tension left its posture. She moved to the second cub, repeating the process with the same methodical patience. It was at this precise moment that the mother arrived. Adult Vex-3 were impressive in the way that natural disasters were impressive. They commanded attention not through deliberate effort, but simply by virtue of existing in a space that suddenly seemed far too small to contain them. The mother was a particularly fine specimen, nearly 4.5 meters of perfectly evolved killing machine, with scars that spoke of successful hunts across a dozen worlds, and eyes that burned with the sort of cold intelligence that made lesser species remember why evolution had favoured things with very sharp teeth. She emerged from the tree line with the fluid grace of something that had never, in her entire existence, needed to worry about being prey. Her arrival was accompanied by the sort of absolute silence that occurred when every other living thing in the immediate area suddenly remembered they had urgent business elsewhere. The woman looked up from the second cub, medical supplies scattered around her knees, her hands covered in the darker ichor that served as Vex-3 blood. For a moment that stretched like eternity, predator and prey stared at each other across the small clearing, both trying to process a situation that violated every known principle of how the universe was supposed to work. The mother's first instinct was simple and straightforward. Eliminate the threat to her cubs. The fact that the threat appeared to be providing medical assistance rather than attempting harm was irrelevant. Prey species didn't help predator species. This was clearly some form of elaborate trap or deception, and the appropriate response was immediate and overwhelming violence. But as she prepared to launch herself forward, something held her back. Perhaps it was the obvious care with which the human was handling her cubs. Perhaps it was the complete lack of fear or aggression in the woman's posture. Or perhaps it was simply the sheer impossibility of the situation, which was so contrary to every natural law that even her predatory instincts seemed uncertain how to respond. The woman, meanwhile, had come to her own conclusions about the situation. The adult Vex-3 was clearly the cub's mother, was clearly capable of ending her existence without significant effort, and was clearly trying to decide whether to do exactly that. The rational response would be to back away slowly, possibly while making apologetic gestures, and hope that maternal gratitude outweighed predatory instinct. Instead, she turned her attention back to the second cub, whose leg was still tangled in wire, and continued working to free it. "I'm almost done," she said, conversationally, as if addressing a concerned parent at a pediatric clinic rather than an apex predator who was having what appeared to be an existential crisis. "The cuts aren't too deep, but you'll want to keep them clean. I don't suppose you have anything like antiseptic in your hunting supplies?" The mother Vex-3, lacking the necessary linguistic framework to process this question, simply continued staring while every certainty she'd ever held about the universe quietly crumbled around her. The universe had clearly run out of sensible responses to offer, because what happened next defied approximately 4 billion years of evolutionary psychology in the span of 30 seconds. The woman finished freeing the second cub, carefully unwinding the last bit of wire from its injured leg with the sort of gentle precision typically reserved for defusing explosives. The cub, now freed but still confused about whether it should be grateful or homicidal, limped a few steps away before settling down with its sibling. Both juveniles watched their mother with the hopeful expectation of creatures who assumed she had some sort of plan for dealing with this biological impossibility. Their mother, unfortunately, was operating in completely uncharted territory. Her brain, evolved over millions of years to process threat assessment, hunting strategies, and territorial disputes, was attempting to categorize a situation that had no existing framework. The biochemical signals flooding her system were contradictory to the point of absurdity. Maternal protection protocols demanded she defend her cubs from the approaching threat, while threat recognition systems insisted there was no threat to defend against, while higher cognitive functions pointed out that prey species providing medical aid to predators was roughly equivalent to gravity flowing upward. The woman, seemingly oblivious to the existential crisis she was causing, opened her medical kit and began cleaning the wounds on both cubs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd handled plenty of injured animals. She used antiseptic wipes with the same casual competence she'd shown while freeing them, speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to have a remarkably calming effect on creatures designed by nature to be calmed by nothing short of a successful kill. "These should heal fine," she murmured, applying what appeared to be some form of liquid bandage to the deeper cuts. The wire was clean, so there shouldn't be much risk of infection, though I suppose your immune systems are probably more robust than anything we're used to dealing with. The mother took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, then took another step, then stopped again. This sort of behavioural uncertainty was not typically associated with apex predators, who generally approached problems with decisive action and overwhelming force. But then, apex predators generally didn't encounter problems quite like this one. The woman looked up again, meeting the mother's burning gaze with the sort of direct eye contact that most prey species instinctively avoided. What she saw there wasn't aggression, exactly, but rather a kind of deep confusion that reminded her of the way domestic animals looked when their owners did something that violated their understanding of how the world worked. "I think they'll be fine," she said, addressing the mother directly. "The injuries look worse than they are. Cubs are resilient." The mother Vex3 made a sound that might have been agreement, or confusion, or possibly the physiological equivalent of a system error. It was a low, rumbling vocalization that her cubs seemed to recognize, because they immediately perked up and began making small chirping sounds in response. The sort of sounds that apex predators definitely weren't supposed to make, but which were unmistakably the universal language of young creatures seeking maternal attention. The woman smiled at this display, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing she could have done. Smiles in the Galactic community were generally interpreted as either threat displays or signs of mental instability. What they definitely weren't supposed to be was expressions of genuine pleasure at witnessing family bonding among creatures who could disassemble her without significant effort. The mother registered this expression and felt something unprecedented happen in her neural pathways. The smile wasn't predatory, it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't even particularly confident, it was simply pleased. Pleased that her cubs were safe, pleased that their injuries weren't serious, pleased that the situation had resolved itself favourably. It was the sort of expression that mothers of any species might wear when seeing their offspring cared for by someone else. The realization hit her with the force of a small asteroid. This prey creature had helped her cubs not despite being prey, but because helping was simply what she did. There was no strategy, no long-term survival calculation, no attempt to gain tactical advantage. She had seen injured young creatures and responded with immediate care, regardless of species, size, or the potential danger to herself. It was, by every measure of galactic civilization, completely insane. It was also, by some deeper measure that transcended civilization entirely, the most natural thing imaginable. The mother Vex-3 looked at her cubs, now clean and bandaged and obviously more comfortable, then back at the small human who had accomplished what her own predatory nature could never have managed. She had made the situation better simply by being willing to try. And then, in a decision that would echo through xenobiological research for generations, she made a choice that violated every known principle of apex predator behavior. She stepped back, not a strategic retreat, not a tactical repositioning, but a clear, deliberate acknowledgement that this particular prey creature posed no threat to her offspring, and had, in fact, proven herself more capable of caring for them than many predators could manage. The galactic communication networks were woefully unprepared for the data packet that began propagating through quantum relays 3 days later. The Vex-3 scouts had filed their incident report with clinical precision, and the desperate hope that writing things down might make them make sense. Vex-3 hunting party, Echo 7 to Predator command. Prey specimen demonstrates unprecedented behavioral anomalies. Classification protocols may require revision. Also, please send better alcohol. The subsequent report, complete with recorded footage, caused what historians would later term the Great Classification Crisis of 2387. Within hours, xenobiologists across 17 star systems reached the same conclusion. Either the Vex-3 had staged an elaborate hoax, or galactic species classification was built on demonstrably incorrect assumptions. Meanwhile, on Kepler 442c, the woman was discovering that caring for 2 juvenile apex predators was more challenging than expected. The cubs, Click and Whistle, based on their attention-seeking sounds, required 30 kilograms of protein daily each, and possessed an alarming tendency to practice hunting on her furniture. The mother had taken residence in the forest behind the dwelling, hunting to feed her cubs, while grappling with philosophical implications. Every instinct demanded she reclaim her offspring from prey species contact. Every observation confirmed her cubs were healthier and more content under this human's care. Colony administrators responded with bureaucratic panic when they discovered the situation. Emergency sessions were called, regulations consulted, strongly worded memos drafted. The consensus was clear. Harbouring apex predator juveniles violated several dozen safety protocols. The woman listened politely and pointed out that Click fetched her morning newspaper, while Whistle scared off local waste raiding pests. The cubs, she explained, were earning their keep. This failed to convince administrators, who noted that earning their keep wasn't adequate response to potential violent death by apex predator attack. The debate might have continued indefinitely, except for the arrival of the first Vex-3 diplomatic vessel in recorded history. The ship's commander requested to meet the human who had corrupted standard predator-prey dynamics through inappropriate nurturing protocols. The meeting occurred in the woman's garden, where Click and Whistle were engaged in competitive eating involving local herbivore remains. The diplomatic commander observed with fascination typically reserved for collapsing stars. "Your species has broken the food chain," the commander said, in carefully practiced human standard. The woman, scrubbing ichor stains from Whistle's hide while the cub purred, looked up with confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" Predator hunts prey. Prey flees predator. You have disrupted this system. Oh, that. She returned to scrubbing. Well, they were injured. What was I supposed to do? The commander processed this while Click stole Whistle's dinner and was chased around the garden in mock warfare. Your species is dangerous, the commander said finally. Dangerous. You adopt things. Regardless of classification or threat level, you see something needing care and adopt it. The commander's voice carried awe or terror. Reports from 17 systems show humans providing medical aid to predators, establishing sanctuaries, forming friendships with creatures that should eat them. The woman considered this while Click and Whistle groomed each other's claws. Is that bad? From a predator perspective, it's the most terrifying evolutionary development in galactic history. The commander watched both cubs trot over expecting attention. From a mother's perspective, it's the first time I've seen my species' cubs thrive under another's care. The cubs demanded simultaneous scratching while competing for position. The woman obliged with practiced ease. We need to revise our classification system, the commander said eventually. Oh? The woman found both sweet spots, resulting in synchronized purring audible from orbit. Humans aren't prey species with delusions of grandeur. The commander's tone carried official weight. You are caretakers with delusions that the entire galaxy is your responsibility. The woman smiled, that same dangerous expression that started everything. Well, someone has to look after things. Above them, her morning birds settled for daily feeding, unbothered by juvenile apex predators and diplomatic crisis rewriting xenobiological textbooks. They had learned humans could be counted on for regular meals and an inexplicable tendency to care for anything needing care. The universe had found its strangest joke. The most dangerous species in the galaxy was the one that couldn't stop adopting everything else.